Okay, so at this point, we learned how we can write tests, that we should use the AAA pattern, that we also should write more than one test to also check different scenarios and also check for certain things we don't want to happen or certain values we expect to get if invalid values are passed in. And with that, we already learned a lot about writing tests. But is that all we should do for this add function, for this unit? Should we write more tests? Well, generally, this answer is impossible to answer because that depends on you and your expectations. You want to, of course, be pretty thorough. You want to think about a lot of different scenarios that could occur and write appropriate tests. But ultimately, writing good tests is an iterative process, which means you write your tests and then you continue working on your code. And maybe you also work on different code in a different file. But at some point you come back and you change something here and you see that, oh, I should now write a new test to handle some new case, some new possible invalid value that could be passed in or anything like this. So it's possible that you should write more tests, but it always depends. You can, of course, and you typically will, add more tests over time, because the more you work on a project, of course, the more ideas you have on how a certain unit could be used incorrectly or how it should produce different values in different situations. And then you always want to check your existing tests and see if they do cover all these main scenarios you can think about. And therefore, there is no right or wrong answer, but you always want to be open to adding more tests, and you always want to think about possible values, invalid values, maybe situations where things could crash, things like this. Now here, for this function, there are at least 3 more tests which I do want to write, though of course I will say that it wouldn't be horrible if you don't add them, but I have 3 ideas or 3 tests that make sense to me here. The first new test which I do want to write here is that I want to check if the function yields 0 as a sum if an empty array is provided. Because an empty array is of course a special kind of input value, and maybe the function could also crash if an empty array is passed in. Or maybe your expectation is that it should crash. There are different expectations you could have. Here my expectation is that if an empty array of numbers is passed into the add function, it does not crash, but it returns 0 as a sum instead. Therefore, I will arrange a numbers array which is empty. I will then call add and pass in my empty numbers array and get that result. And then my expectation is that result is 0 with the to-be function. So that's one additional test I want to write. In addition, I want to check what happens if I don't pass in any number. So if no argument is passed into add. And I would say it might make more sense that we get an error then. So it should throw an error if no value is passed into the function. That's my expectation here. And again, you could have a different expectation, but for me here, it makes sense that if I call a function called add without passing in any values, that I then get an error. So therefore here, I don't even have an arrange phase because I don't want to pass anything into the function. And instead, I'll get my result here and I pass no value to add. But how do I now write that I expect this to throw an error? Because an error is not really a value returned by this function. Instead, as you know, in JavaScript, errors bubble up. So therefore, how can we check whether add caused an error? Well, for this we have to change our code here a little bit.